There. So I'm excited that we got Scott Macmillan in the house today. My name is Matthew, right? Creator of the Junior Resource Investing podcast and Substack. Thank you for tuning in. Full house keeps getting bigger and bigger. This is my 5th time hosting Scott of Invictus here, and I'm excited to have him back. It's been about 6 months, but obviously the story has come alive again a bit. There's a bit of some energy in the air again in the market with Invictus. Riding shotgun with me today is Jamie Vinnels. He's an independent geological advisor and also an investor in Invictus, and he's here just to play the brains to my, I don't know if you could call me the face of the organization, but I'm something. Questions here today are posed by you. There will be written Q&A, so feel free to type that in. No guarantees that we'll get to them. I'm going to try to keep this to a 2-hour mark just for the sake of everybody's sanity who's involved here. Standard disclaimer before I let Scott go here. Right, this is not financial advice. We're not financial advisors. Entertainment purposes only, and they will have a full disclaimer in the notes below. But all that said, Scott, right, the man we're all here to see is Scott Macmillan, Managing Director of Invictus Energy. Scott, it is good to see you again. Thank you for coming on the show. How are you today?
Hi, Matt. I'm good, thank you. Always a pleasure, and yeah, it has been a little while since we last spoke and had one of these, but looking forward to the next 2 hours. That's I've got as long as we need, but I think for everyone's sanity, we'll try and keep it there. And Jamie, nice to see you again, and hope you've been keeping well too.
Hi.
Yeah, no, we will. Like I say, I think that's well said. 2 hours. I mean, I think some of you are suckers for punishment, but I won't waste too much time here. Let's just jump into it, Scott, if you don't mind. I mean, I think the general flow of this conversation, maybe we'll start with just a general update, but maybe we'll kind of work, past, present, future. Maybe we'll just a little bit of a discussion regarding M1, Mukuyu-1, and then maybe moving on to Mukuyu-2, and then some forward-looking comments after that. Jamie and I will be bouncing back and forth here a little bit, but Scott, maybe just very kind of just to open up the conversation, open up the floor, just as a general update, maybe, right? Where are we now? Where we come from, and where are we going here in terms of Invictus?
Sure. So look, probably just recapping a little bit of Mukuyu-1 first, and the work that we've been doing probably since we last spoke over the last few months. So it's really been processing and integrating the data that we gathered from Mukuyu-1, which is fairly extensive. Digesting it again, first well in the basin, so there's all the information is new. I think that's an important consideration that people need to have, is that this is the first time that anyone's seen any data from the subsurface from the space, and so it does take a little bit of digestion, and it's like a jigsaw puzzle with 1,000 pieces that gets tossed onto the floor, and you're trying to sort it out and figure out what's going on. So there's new bits of information that come in all of the time as well. So you've got a lot of different aspects that you need to kind of get to grips with. So we've been doing that over the last few months, and that's updated our understanding of the basin, what we thought pre-drill going into Mukuyu-1 versus what we think now. And again, that's going to be an evolving picture as we drill more wells and get more information. And then how does that fit into the overall strategy of what we're trying to do? So from a Mukuyu-1 perspective, again, to have the result that we had with the very first one in the basin is phenomenal. I think yes, it could have been better. We could have had the discovery declared, which would have been an absolute unbelievable achievement in that regard. That very, very rarely happens. I think the only one that I can think of in living memory, and it was even before my time, was the Orange Basin in Namibia with the Kudu gas field that was discovered, and that was the very first well that was drilled in the basin. And then it took, that was 1974, and then it took until 2022 for Total to discover the next field in the basin. So this doesn't happen often. So been a good result, very disappointing for us to digest, and obviously a big letdown that we couldn't get a fluid sample and recover that to surface to declare a discovery. So, I'm not going to wallow in self-pity here, but it was very, very disappointing, and the share price reflected that our investors, obviously felt that too. But now I think going into this next one, obviously we have a much greater understanding of what we found in Mukuyu-1, what it means for the basin, and so we've got a lot more confidence now going into Mukuyu-2 than I had going into Mukuyu-1. No one ever goes out intending to drill a dry well, but it happens. That's statistically that's our game. It's part and parcel of what you do, and it's why very few companies are able to open up new basins, because it is very difficult. But we've managed to do that with the very first well. So I'm a lot more relaxed going into Mukuyu-2 than I was going into Mukuyu-1, because the most likely outcome from Mukuyu-1 was a dry hole, and that's just stats that'll anyone can go and look them up from what you get from wildcat drilling. It's a hard game. So now from what we've seen with Mukuyu-1, we've proven everything in the basin: source rock, trap, seal, reservoir, timing, all of it's there. So now it's a question of trying to delineate the basin as quickly as we can, gather as much information in as reasonable amount of time and cost effectively as we can. This is an expensive game as well. It's not like minerals. You can never just drill it out and gather perfect information. There's always going to be uncertainty. There's always going to be risk. So, we'll probably come on to why we've picked this location for Mukuyu-2 later on, but we need to also get to grips with what's in the rest of the basin and what's in the rest of the Mukuyu structure, because it's enormous. It's 200 square kilometers under closure. So, but yeah, from a Mukuyu-1 perspective, obviously prove the presence of all of those petroleum system elements. We've got multiple zones where we've intersected hydrocarbons, and a pity we couldn't get a sample, but we got everything else in terms of our data gathering from there. So that's been a good start. Well, more than a good start, an excellent start. And now we're going to Mukuyu-2 now to come back what we left behind, which is a fluid sample for the next one, gather some new information in a different part of the field. And then I think, our view is once we essentially prove a discovery there, and we've got to do it by the listing rules, then that's going to send us on a very different trajectory from a company point of view, from a share price point of view, and a value point of view, because we've got the control and the running room in the whole basin.
Yeah, well, you pretty much just did a speed run of the whole conversation, so we could probably just end it here and save everyone 2 hours of time. No, I'll rather than trying to piece out there's lots of questions I wanted to ask you there, but I think that maybe I'll try to just remain on track here, and as I say, kind of discuss Mukuyu-1 here a bit, core analysis, and then hole stability and where things were left is maybe the topic here. But just maybe, if you don't mind, I want to talk about, obviously you probably heard about it a lot. You and I spoke last week and I asked you about it, and I'm sure you're getting it all the time. I do want to talk about the sidewall core analysis and what and when sort of thing. But I guess maybe before I kind of get too specific, are there any, just generally speaking, updates on rock or fluid analysis that you can just provide for us or provide color on that?
Sure. So we're just putting together the last bits and pieces of information and integrating it from a fluids perspective. We've got some more mud gas results, as we indicated in a release a couple of weeks ago, and then the sidewall core analysis. There's still some work to do on those. We've got some special core analysis going on with the reservoir sample. So with core analysis, there's a few different aspects to it. You've got, and we cut sidewall cores in different parts of the formation. So you go and get reservoir, obviously, because that's where your hydrocarbons are stored. But you also go and get source rock samples, and you get other intervals, shall we call them, to help calibrate your log. So there were a couple of anomalous log responses that we get, because you just get a picture from the measurements that you get, and they're just curvy lines on a log track, and you've got to make sense of them. And so some of these cores that we cut were to have a look at what that log response was telling us. So from a reservoir perspective, out of I think we recovered 21 samples out of the 24 attempts that we made. Pretty good recovery. Only 8 of those are reservoir, and the rest are either seal, source, and core. So there's not a lot of reservoir samples that we actually collated. Further to that, we've got a large number of reservoirs that we intersected as well. So we didn't even get a sample out of every reservoir either, because we had 11 reservoirs that we intersected in the Upper Angwer. We had, I'm trying to think back to the logs now, we've probably got 4, 5, or 6 in separate reservoirs in the Pebbly Arcos, and then we've got source intervals in all of them. So the source intervals you use to try and get some of your biostratigraphy information. We, again, first well in the basin, we need to understand the age of these rocks so that we can help calibrate the basin model and the timing, the provenance of them, the depositional environment that they've come from. All of this information feeds into that. So, and then some of the reservoir samples we've got, unfortunately, and there were some pictures in the reports, have disked, so they're broken apart, so you can't actually get porosity and permeability, not accurate porosity and permeability information of those, because they've got to fit in a rubber sleeve that you put into the machine that does that works, the CMS, depending which lab you're using. So we've got a handful of those analyses. The other reason that some of the reservoir stuff is still ongoing is because we've been utilizing a new to us, something that I've never done before, where we're trying to extract hydrocarbons out of those reservoir samples to match them with the mud gas samples that we have at similar depths. So the reason that we're doing that is because we didn't get fluid samples out of those reservoir sections, and you get those samples, and it's a clean sample, so you got what's called a virgin sample out of the reservoir, and that's what you use for your fluid information to calibrate your reservoir information, and understand your reservoir fluid properties. So if it's oil, if it's gas, your dew points and bubble points, how the hydrocarbon phase behavior is going to, we won't go down hydrocarbon phase behavior rabbit holes. It's going to be an interesting one with this, because of the volatile nature of where we sit on the phase envelope for these particular fluids. So we've been gathering. So that had to happen first, because we obviously don't want to flush those and then lose the hydrocarbons that were in the cores. So that took a little bit longer than we anticipated. So the pore measurements have been done for most of them, and now we're doing special core analysis and doing the saturation analysis. So again, we don't have to get into the details of how it's done, but this is all done to help us calibrate our log information, because that's what we have over the majority of the formations that we've encountered, and we've got only little spot points now across hundreds of meters of reservoir and formation that we penetrated to try and calibrate that. So later on down the track, we'll cut whole core across all of those, and then that becomes a much easier endeavor to help calibrate your log. So this is, again, new to us. It's taken a little bit longer than we thought, and we've got to go and get all of this information so that we can do a very thorough job with calibrating our logs, rather than releasing small bits of information that are just piecemeal. If we go and release 5 pore perm results, is that representative of everything? It's not. So, and when it's ready, we'll release the results with everything. So it's I've had a lot of questions on it, and people are saying, well, what are you doing with it? Are you hiding it? Why aren't you releasing the information? And we had the same issue with when we were drilling Mukuyu-1, where we were accused of withholding information from the market, and we had a reverse speeding ticket from the ASX. And as soon as we did have the information and we released it, we all saw what happened. And So people are impatient. I understand that. We are too, but we've got to. The work has got to be completed at the lab, and then we've got to integrate it into our workflows and into our understanding. And once we've done that, then we'll release it. So, but the stuff's still at the lab at the moment. So that's the bottom line.
Yeah, not much.
It's done.
Not much you can do about that. I mean, I think that people will appreciate my asking, even if it does make you roll your eyes and you're just too diplomatic maybe to show it. But I mean, is there any sort of timeline, right? People will want me to ask that question, if it's...
So at the moment we're doing porous plate experiments with the cores, which provides you that saturation information. So the way that hydrocarbons migrate into the structure, gets released, and you've the capillary pressure profile that it has when it starts to ingress into the reservoir and flush out the water, the formation water out of your reservoir. You get that profile so that you can help calibrate, and that amount will depend on how far you are above the free water level, and so there's you take it in steps, and that's going on at the moment. So and porous plate experiments take as long as they take. So it just depends on how the rocks respond.
Yeah, fair.
So I don't have a guide at the moment. And to be honest, I'm a little bit kind of further back from the technical stuff than I was last year, because we built the team up, and that responsibility has been taken away from me as well. So it's obviously I love the technical aspect. That's my background and where I've come from, but it was unsustainable, like me micromanaging everything. So I've got a new exploration manager that's come on board, and someone that I worked with previously, and really thrilled to have him, very and made my life infinitely easier. And he's much better at it than I am as well. So again, I think employing people that are better than you to come and do the, aspects of it is a sign of Invictus maturing, and it's not, it shouldn't be a one-man band. It's too big to be a one-man band. And so I'm a little bit further away from all the technical stuff and timelines and everything than I used to be as well. So I don't have an exact time frame of when it's going to be done, but I'll leave it to the team, and they get on with it. And when it's ready, we'll release it.
Well, I think that anybody who's been following your story for a while or has tuned into previous updates from you with this knows how intimately and actively you've been involved on site there. So I think everyone's kind of glad that maybe you get a chance to have a team around you of capable people that you can trust to work with you and push in the same direction. I won't belabor the point with the sidewall core, right? I think it's kind of one of those things where there's not much you can tell us until it's been released, and we'll take it from there. But maybe just one last question around Mukuyu-1. Just regarding how the state of the hole that's been left and the stability the state of stability it's in. So it's been left plugged and abandoned. Is it permanently plugged, or are you able to re-enter it later on?
No, so that's been P&A'd. Wellhead's been removed, so we'll be able to reuse that wellhead in a future well. And to be honest, given the borehole stability issues that we had with Mukuyu-1, re-entering that is a fool's errand. You get a lot of companies or a lot of attempts to go and redo it. It was cased down to the 905S and shoe, and we could have potentially re-drilled that. But I think what we've, it's probably getting onto why we've picked this location for Mukuyu-2 as well. But I think given the issues that we had, and it was a number of fronts. It was the mud weight, the mud composition, and the chemistry, and then also the cementing performance with Mukuyu-1 meant that trying to suspend it and come back later and reuse that wellbore was just wasn't the right decision. And so given the state it was in, we would have had to re-drill everything, demob all the services, and come back and essentially get no new information all you're doing is twinning that 8.5-inch section that we drilled. We think we're better off now with Mukuyu-2 going to another part of the field and getting new information there and still being able to go and retrieve a fluid sample. So from a cost perspective, it's probably not much more incrementally from re-drilling that section to a fresh drill for Mukuyu-2. And really that's around the logistics costs and what it costs to mobilize equipment and people and get everything moving. So I think now we've come in with a better well design for Mukuyu-2. We've changed up, and we needed time as well to do that. So change up the mud chemistry for Mukuyu-2 and the fluid program, refine the well design. We've got pore pressure work that we've been able to do now to get the mud weights right. And again, we can discuss what's changed from Mukuyu-2. So Mukuyu-1, we at some stage we're going to go back to that part of the field and drill again, but it won't be at Mukuyu-1, and we might drill a different type of well depending on what we're targeting. So drilling deviated. Mukuyu-1 for the very first one on the basin, drilling a 33-degree incline well was pretty spicy, especially because we were doing it using mud motors. We weren't using rotary steerables, older technology from a drilling point of view. So believe it or not, things could have gone a lot worse from a hole stability point of view. So I think making this next well simpler, fulfilling those objectives that I mentioned, going back to prove up the discovery with Mukuyu-2 is fine, but we'll be able to go and revisit where Mukuyu-1 is, and we will do on that southern flank's a big area as well. So we'll go and do that at some stage. But I think moving to a new part of the field for Mukuyu-2 is a good move for this next well.
Mm-hmm. Just one more here to return to the question of hole stability, and I'll turn it over to Jamie to discuss Mukuyu-2. But this will be, I'm just reading this verbatim from a Geo, so I apologize if I've missed something here. But Geo is asking here, please give a quick rundown on the root causes of the time-dependent hole stability issues, not the differential sticking in both M1 and the sidetrack. Were they related 100% to mud properties, or is there a basin-wide or regional stress regime involved? And how exactly does Invictus propose to address that issue in Mukuyu-2?
Sure. So the time dependency of this, because the borehole did hold up relatively well. So in the mother bore, when we drilled through the pebbly arcos, the mud weight was wrong. So we were way too high, and we ended up taking some losses in the pebbly arcos. So we had to put in what's called LCM, loss control material, and that is basically stuff to plug up any of the fractures that you've created, because essentially with the mud weight too high, you fracture the reservoir and you start to lose your drilling fluid out into the formation. So we ended up plugging up a bunch of that and running that throughout the pebbly arcos. Then we drilled in through the upper angua. By the time that we ended up, and then we logged it, we had those issues with the filter cake on the side of the wellbore. If you remember those photos from some previous releases, and that's why we couldn't get fluid samples. We were waiting for an additional sampling tool because that was late in being mobilized. We then deepened the well down to 3,900 meters. By the time we went back then to log that deepened section, the wellbore had been open for in that section for about 26 days, which is a really long time. And we were drilling with water-based mud. So what tends to happen is that if you've got clays in your formation, those tend to react and they start to swell with the water-based mud. And that's what happened with us. Eventually, we didn't get as much swelling initially because we dumped that filter cake up the side of the well bore, and nothing could get through it because it was so thick. So, but eventually, it started to break down and swell, and we were also inclined as well, which also creates issues with because you're going to get low sides of the hole where when you're running drill pipe up and down it, it's going to scrape, and you're going to break some of that off, and eventually it's going to start to break down. So because of the issues that we had whilst we were drilling, and we had to stop and do all of that loss circulation control with 3 or 4 incidences that we had, plus deepening and everything else, that it was just, the borehole was just open too long. So the next time, if you look at our plan to drill that 8.5 inch section and then log it, that should only take us from the time that we start drilling the 8.5 inch section to when we TD should be less than a week. So you're always conscious of borehole stability issues when you're drilling, whether you're drilling with especially water-based mud. Synthetic, because you don't have that water in it, your clays tend to not react, and you don't get that swelling effect. So getting back to what we've done to address that. So again, now we've got some data from Mukuyu-1. We've got, through all of the cuttings that we've gathered, we can have a look, and we've done XRD on it to understand what the mineralogy of what we've encountered is, so that we can design the mud system around to ensure that we minimize the potential of the mud reacting with the formation. So we've changed the mud chemistry now for the next well, and that is and also a lot less solids now, because we've also got data on the pore pressure regime from those pressure samples that we took. We understand now that we're in a normally pressured environment, and not, we don't have to weight the mud as high as we did, and that probably also played a role in the borehole stability issues, that we were just way overbalanced in Mukuyu-1. So we've now had a complete pore pressure regime done by an independent specialist. This is what they do across, using Mukuyu-1, and projected it across the basin and where we're drilling. So we've now got a mud weight that's designed for each sort of section of the hole, and it's being calibrated in a much now we've got some data. The mud chemistry has been changed, the mud weights have been changed, and less solid. So we're not going to need barite, which we had to get the mud weight up that high for these other sections. So that filter cake that we had also shouldn't be an issue, and we shouldn't have the reactivity in some parts of the reservoir, or not the reservoir, in the shale sections where you've got a lot of the clays.
So I think that actually is a decent transition here. We have a whole section on mud coming up, but I think I'll hand it over to Jamie here. We'll discuss Mukuyu-2 and specifically, as you've kind of been touching on here already, kind of in guessing where we're headed here, but just how Mukuyu-1 influences your decision-making process for Mukuyu-2. Jamie, do you want to take it away here?
Yeah, sure. I guess one of the main changes is the original proposed M2 location was kind of off to the northwest, a couple of Ks. Yep. And now you have it as 3 or 4 kilometers to the northeast. And looking at the new top Angua map, the structure appears to be somewhat different than in previous presentations. And M2 now looks to be drilling on what looks like a 3-way against a fault, with several hundred meters of closure. Was that the reason for the change, to target one of the more obvious closures on the map? Was it driven by access to the surface sites, for example?
No, so none of it's really surface dependent. Okay. If you have a look at the photos that we have of you can see from an access point of view, it's very, very easy. The topography is very simple and straightforward, so we can really drill anywhere from unless we're close to someone's homestead, but it's pretty sparsely populated out there. We're unlikely, particularly around Mukuyu, and there's a very subtle expression of the anticline that you can see on Google Earth where the vegetation changes around Mukuyu. So the main reason that we've moved from where we initially postulated where it was going to go, sort of sticking on that southern flank, which is I think we talked about in one of my previous webinars, where there's been a couple of reasons for that change. Firstly, we've had velocity data now that we gathered from Mukuyu-1 from the VSP, where that's had quite a subtle effect on the seismic reprocessing. So that's been one minor thing. The big change has been a difference in our pick in some of the shallower sections in that horse block that you mentioned. So we've had a different. Previously, we were picking it the top dandy a little bit lower in that seismic section. If you have a look at that release that we put out, and that's pulled everything up, and it looks a bit more sensible from a pick perspective now. And in that location where that horse block is, that 3-way that you mentioned, it is shallower by about 400 meters. So drilling up dips, always a good idea. I guess the nature of that block means that we can drill a near vertical well, so that the trajectory, the maximum deviation is only going to be 12 degrees, which is basically near vertical. So it's a much simpler well. And then probably also, given the shallower nature of that block, it means that and the lower amount of deviation means that we can actually test the lower angua in this location where we've picked that. So that means that's another potential reservoir interval that we can then test as well. So that's what really factored into our thinking. I think also what's fed into that is, now that we've got an understanding of the source rock quality and distribution, we're pretty comfortable that this source rock is pervasive over the basin. So you're always concerned about, where's my source rock? How is it migrating into the structure? And going too far away from your well control, there's always a concern about migration distance and where your source is. So given what we've seen, we're very comfortable and think that this is going to be pretty pervasive. I think some of the mud gas has also indicated to us that there's multiple charge histories, there's multiple source rock intervals. So we've got both local and intraformational source rock and charge, where some of these intervals are self-sourcing within the angua, and we've also got some deeper charge within the basin elsewhere on the flanks, where the source rock is deeper and in the gas window now, and we've got that dry gas influence that's come in as well, in addition to the liquids that have been generated. So that there's a pretty big kitchen in the north as you get towards the Mozambique border and the Gunona syncline, where we think that is what's feeding the dry gas into the structure. So that's got to come from the north all the way across. So again, we think it's, from a migration point of view, fairly low risk now, and that's what's given us, again, I guess the comfort to kind of step over into another block and go and test that. So that'll provide us with the ability to test the lower angua, get some information in a different part of the field, and we've got to try and characterize this basin as quickly as we can as well. And staying on that southern flank wouldn't have given us it would have given us some new information, but I think we're, in terms of bang for your buck, this will be better for us going to the north. We would have had to do it at some stage anyway.
Were the changes in the picks, was that driven by the biostratigraphy data, or did you do any kind of rock physics work, like QI work?
It's mainly the QI stuff.
Okay.
Biostrat data is pretty sparse, unfortunately. We haven't
Or
I think
Permian or something?
Well, the Permian we haven't penetrated yet.
Oh, right.
That's deeper, but there's not a lot of biostrat. There's barely any bugs in from what we can what's come out of the cuttings. So that it hasn't given us much in terms of the age of what we understood pre-drill versus post-drill. So it's fairly sparse from a palynology point of view.
You mentioned the dry gas to the north versus liquids from elsewhere. Do you think that reflects the different source rock types, or just different parts of the basin or in different parts of the kind of petroleum generation cycle? Some are deeper or hotter.
So the quality of the source rock is probably a lot more liquid prone than we thought pre-drill. We do have different intervals of source, so there is a little bit of variation in the I guess the liquids yield of that source rock, but it's mainly down to thermal maturity. So if you're up shallow in the oil window, it's generating liquids. As you get deeper, it's generating more gas. So in the northern part in the kitchen, and you can see that from the structure maps, it kind of plunges down, and that depot center in the basin is anywhere between 12 and 16 kilometers thick in terms of sedimentary thickness. So absolutely huge. So as you plunge off to the north, you get a lot of that angler that's buried in that dry gas window, and it's going to just migrate straight up into the Mukuyu structure. And it's got Mukuyu, because of the size of it, it's 200 square kilometers, but also because of the vertical relief, it's just got a huge fetch area which just sucks everything in from everywhere around the basin in the north, until we start getting further east then, and this is why we're shooting seismic in the eastern part, because you've got a little bit of a saddle there, and then you've got the opportunity for some of those structures in the east then to start fetching, have got a different fetch area, and out of the migration, shadow is not the right word, but the migration pathway of Mukuyu.
Yeah, the focus of the trap versus the kitchen at the time of hydrocarbon generation. That's the key thing.
So it's,
yeah, sorry.
There is some proto structure, and again, we should probably keep this as simple as we can from a terminology point of view, just for the benefit of everyone. So that was always one of the key risks going in pre-drill with Mukuyu-1. We were unsure of the timing of the trap versus charge, and so from some of the isopack thickness maps that we've generated, so that means if you flatten it on an age and where you've picked that structure, we've had some structure in Mukuyu for quite a long time, which has meant that it's been trapping since it's been in the generation window for a couple of 100 million years, and we think most of it though has happened around the Cretaceous time.
Okay.
But now we've also got source rock that's in the present day generation window, which means it's actively accumulating present day. So we've got,
that's good.
Yeah. So there's been, as you said, there's lots of source rock intervals. It's not just one we're relying on, and that means that it kind of doesn't matter where it sits in time. Now you've got source rock somewhere within those intervals actively charging it. So
yeah, we'll move on a bit to to very broadly summarize, I think there's a lot of concerns with monitoring the operation in the next well. There's a lot of questions about having the appropriate specialist skills on site versus having them remote. Are there plans to change anything up and have more specialist staff on site, specifically, like a pore pressure person, a petrophysicist, for example? Or, in this day and age, a lot can be done remotely, I guess, because it's just looking at digits on a computer. You don't have to be on the drilling deck watching the digits arrive, you know. But I think there's a lot of concerns about getting the sample and proving discovery, basically. So what's kind of in place to ensure that?
So there's been quite a number of changes for this campaign, and I think that the failure to get a sample in the first well wasn't due to any lack of oversight or monitoring, whether it was at the well site or remotely. It was a function of the drilling conditions, the mud weight, and tool failures. And if we talk about the tool failures, that was not a lack of QA/QC initially. Things were late and things were rushed, but for the first few runs, those tools worked. We couldn't get a sample because we had that thick filter cake on it, which meant nothing was getting, we weren't going to get anything out of it. Didn't matter what kind of tools we had on site. So these things happen, and it's one of the challenges of a remote operation is that you don't have access to contingencies very quickly. So having said that, though, we have gone in with a much bigger contingency plan for this next well. So firstly, we've changed providers from a wireline point of view, because there were some aspects that we were unhappy with in the first well. Those tools are all undergoing independent QA/QC before they leave the supply base and they come to us, so that we know at least they've been through all of their checks, all the run histories, any issues that they've had previously we're going to know about, and they've got time to rectify any issues. They'll also be present before we rig up the wireline unit as well, and do further checks once it gets to the well site, because again, we've got to transport these tools by road across the continent. So there's always, they're sensitive, there's vibrational issues that can play a part in the electronics in some of these, and they are operating at very high pressures and very high temperatures, and you're going to get failures, and it happens, and that's why you have backups. From a personnel point of view, we vet all the CVs of all the engineers that come out from the service providers, and we reject the ones that we don't think are experienced enough. So we've got experienced engineers that are coming out to the job. Our well site geologists as well are used to running remote operations and being self-sufficient, because you do have, and I've been involved in instances as well where I've been one of the remote people out specifically for the wireline job, where you've had comms issues and and then you're responsible for making the decisions without that remote support from town. So we've got capable engineers, capable well site geos. We've got also, we'll be remotely monitoring the operations from town, and we've got the ability to see on the engineer's screen exactly what they're looking at. Open phone line. Well, it's not phones anymore, but Teams chat to chat with the guys in the wireline shack, or the well site geos who are there so that they, we can have an open discussion and dialogue. And they've got in Perth, they've got a real-time center here. I've spent many hours in it on fluid sampling jobs in a previous life. So, and I know, the guy who's going to be sitting in there with me from the service provider as well. And so we've got, we're covered from an engineering point of view and an operations point of view in that respect, as far as we can. So the tool issues, you're going to have, tools fail, and you've got to have backups in place and everything else. So we have got a much fuller evaluation suite as well, because before we were going out with a very a more appropriate data acquisition suite for a wildcat exploration well. You can't just throw everything at it, because it's expensive. Wireline, from a cost point of view, is about a third of what it costs from an evaluation perspective excluding the logistics I'm talking about, costs you about, for where we are in a remote operation, costs about a third of what our drilling cost is. So that's all the directional drilling, the cement, the rig, everything else. So it's an expensive suite of and an expensive product line that you're running. So we do take a lot of attention to it and a lot of care, but it's our primary means of evaluating what is in your wellbore. Sorry, Jamie, carry on.
I think Matthew had a few questions on the kind of nitty-gritty of the sampling plan in a success case.
Yep.
He's muted.
You're on mute, Matt.
Thanks, guys. Trying to be polite, then I forget about it there. Yeah, no, Jamie's right. Just questions around. So, I mean, discussing the kind of the goal of Mukuyu-2, right? I mean, this is obviously going to be hypotheticals through and through, but I mean, maybe the question is, what's your core target, which I think is that the market knows. Maybe you can discuss that. But then, I mean, is the ultimate aim of this drill? I mean, what does capital S success look like? I mean, is there a potential for 4 separate discoveries in the post-Dandy, the Pebbly Arcos, Upper Angua, and Lower Angua, or what are you kind of hoping to get out of this, out of Mukuyu-2?
Yeah, so there is that potential for 4 separate accumulations. It's not uncommon to have hydrocarbons at different stratigraphic levels. So, from a discovery point of view, you just need one of those to work and to get a fluid sample to surface from one of those. So, and I think from a Mukuyu perspective, because the structure is so big and so extensive, that means that if any one of those that we can prove that it's material. So obviously we want to prove up as many as we can. So because we're in the early part of this basin, you need to bring fluid samples to surface from each one of those to clear a discovery. Now it starts to get a little bit complicated because we've got lots of reservoir intervals, particularly in the Pebbly Arcos and the Upper Angua. So from a discovery point of view, if you get fluid samples out of one of those reservoir intervals, but then you have a pressure gradient profile and you get that with your pressure points, and they lie on the same gradient, you can then deduce, well, this is actually the same column, and then you only need to get one sample out of those. I think for us that's unlikely, just given the vertical extent of the Upper Angua. It's 900 meters or something. It's pretty unlikely that we've got a 900 meter column. So it's likely to be some separate accumulations within that, because we've got probably 100 meters in between on average every cycle that we have of reservoir source seal. So we're unlikely, if we just get out of one reservoir, great result. So we've got to, and again, this all goes into your planning pre-job. So we've got fluid sampling chambers, and so these are pressurized chambers that you've got to bring back to the surface. So we've got 18 of them, and generally when you are taking samples, you take a primary and you take a backup, because sometimes you have issues with the sample chambers, the seals closing and firing, and also in the volumes of samples, we've got what are called MPSRs. They're 450 cc's in terms of volume, and you need to get enough to go around to do all the analysis that you want to do. So typically you take 2 or 3 at each station, so that our sampling will be informed by what we encounter in Mukuyu-2. Number of reservoirs we have, which ones are hydrocarbon bearing, which ones we choose to get, and we'll obviously prioritize the ones we think we need to go and get samples out of. So if we have a lot in the Upper Angua, some of the Pebbly Arcos, obviously we want to go and get Pebbly Arcos and Upper Angua, so we're going to have to sacrifice then, assuming that we can get samples out of every one of them, we're going to have to sacrifice some of the other ones in the Upper Angua. So people say, well, why don't you just go and get more sample chambers? It's not as simple as that. They are in short supply. They're expensive. My God, to keep these things on rental they are hugely expensive. And I think if we get enough, and we'll be able to get pressure points and then prove that it's a hydrocarbon gradient out of them. And some of them will probably use the fluid analyzer on board, and we'll just pump out and we won't actually take the sample. So there's a number of ways we'll be able to kind of prove up some additional ones beyond the ones we get fluid samples out of. So you can't go and get everything. We're not just targeting one reservoir like maybe some of our, I think most of our investors are probably Australian based, and Perth Basin wise, using the Kenya as an example, that's one reservoir, so you can go and take one 6-pack, you've got samples up, it's one, just one column. It's quite simple. We've got a much more complicated setup in the Cabora Bassa. So we don't have an unlimited budget. We can't keep these things on rental for forever. We can't get enough of, we've had to borrow and steal to get even 18 chambers. And so you can't just have as much as you want. And then also you can only fit a particular number on each run because of a weight limitation that you have with your tools when you're running wireline as well. So that would mean if you were to get any more than that, you've got to go and do a separate run. You're then getting into, again, going back to the borehole stability, you're starting to add more risk the longer your program takes. And sampling does take a long time. You've got to sit on the borehole wall, cleaning up, sometimes for several hours to get a clean sample. So it's all about managing risk, making sure that you get what you come for, and getting an appropriate amount of data.
No, thank you. I think that is enlightening and provides color for people. 18 fluid sampling chambers. No, thank you. I guess maybe a follow-up question then. Let's assume that there is a pay zone encountered. Will you be running an MDT tool on that interval to confirm movable pay prior to drilling ahead, or what's your plan there?
No, so the base plan is to drill the section to TD, and then you go in and run your wireline. So you don't just run in with an MDT tool or RFT tool, whichever provider that you're using, because you've then got to condition the hole for logging. So you've got to circulate out your mud, circulate the bottoms up, spot your logging pill, pull the drill string out, get the wireline unit set up, go and get your primary logs, which are your gamma ray, resistivity, density and neutron. And then you've then got to log that section, pull that out, put your MDT tool together and run that in the hole. And you also need to drill a logging pocket as well so that you can get the tools over that interval. So that from a time efficiency point of view and a risk point of view, that's not the way to do it. You drill through all the way to bottom, and then you log everything at once from your primary logs. We've also upsized our data acquisition program to help us again. So we're going to be getting NMR, which is nuclear magnetic resonance. So that helps us. That will provide us some extra information on porosity and indications of permeability, and then also FMI, which is formation microimaging log, which is like an image of your borehole. It needs some interpretation, but it also helps. It helps you refine your picks for sampling and everything else, and just gives you some more information. So we're going to run those as well before we go into sample. So if you stop every time you encounter hydrocarbons, it will actually add on a lot more time and a lot more risk to your drilling program, because you don't just whip it out of the hole and run your MDT probe and sampling chambers. And it takes a lot more than that to do it. So probably a follow-on question from that would be, well, why don't you do real-time sampling while drilling? I've tried to use it before in previous programs, and again, from a risk and a cost point of view, it adds a lot more onto your program. We're always going to go and run our MDT anyway, just because it's a more comprehensive program, and you add a lot more jewelry onto your bottom hole assembly. And if you lose that, or if you plant one of those tools or lose that bottom hole assembly, then probably north of $7 million that you leave behind in the hole. So never, I found it, from personal experience and some of our team, it's not all it's cracked up to be. And we're always going to go and run MDT anyway. So all it would do is add time and cost and risk to our program.
Thank you, Scott. A bit more specific here in terms of zones of interest. There's a couple of questions regarding Pebbly Arcos and the Upper Angua. Pebbly first, could you provide any further comments on the Pebbly Arcos' net to gross potential?
Yeah, so we saw quite a lot of stacked amalgamated channels in the Pebbly Arcos. Some of it was up to sort of 60 meters thick. And that's high net to gross in those. So in those individual units. So I think rather than talking about the Pebbly Arcos as a whole, we've got separate reservoir intervals within that. And within those reservoir intervals, they're high net to gross, as you'd expect in an amalgamated channel. But if you take it as an overall out of the Pebbly Arcos, not that it's relevant because you wouldn't, your net to gross in an overall system, you're concentrating on your reservoirs because that's where your pay comes from. That might be 20, 25, 30%, something like that on an overall basis, but within those individual reservoirs, it's pretty high.
Thank you. Just taking notes from my own self here too. And so follow-up question here then. Could you comment on whether you've seen viable intra Pebbly Arcos trapping mechanisms?
Yeah, we have. So we've got seal in the Pebbly Arcos as well above those reservoir units. So they do form valid traps.
Excellent. And then maybe I'll just switch over to Upper Angua here. Could you comment to see if do you see any potential for oil to be reservoir down dip of gas condensate accumulations in the lower Upper Angua reservoirs?
Definitely. So looking at the source rock we've encountered, the fluorescence, the mud gas, that'll points to that scenario where we were drilling up on the on that southern flank, drilling up against the fault, and as I mentioned before, we've had multiple periods of charge, and some of the dry gases probably come in later and forced the liquid hydrocarbons down dip. So because gas has a lighter buoyancy than oil, it tends to migrate up to the top of the structure, and then it will push your liquid hydrocarbons, which have a heavier buoyancy, and your water, which is even heavier, further down dip. So we think that's what we saw in Mukuyu-1, where we've had that scenario where, down dip, we're going to have some more liquid hydrocarbons from where we are now. So we drilled Crestal in the southern fault block, if you follow what I'm saying.
When you say liquid hydrocarbons, you mean oil or condensate?
Yeah, light oil.
Light oil.
Condensate. So I don't want to delve too deep into hydrocarbon phase behavior here, but we're on the verge of we are on the verge of volatile oil and very rich gas condensate. So the CGR estimate that we gave of 135 barrels per million scuffs at the upper end, if you get any higher than that, you're actually switching then over to volatile oil. So what I mean by that is in the reservoir, because when you get a sample out and the mud gas, you get everything. With volatile oil, you've got it exists as a liquid in its phase, and when it comes up to surface, it liberates a lot of gas and leaves liquid behind, but it's very light. With gas condensate at that higher end, it exists as a gas in its form in the reservoir, and when it comes up to surface, it will liberate the liquids out. drop that out as condensate. But they at the points and the pressures and the temperatures that we are in some of those reservoirs, that is very, very close, where we're moving between those two realms. So we're right on the edge of what's called the phase envelope. In some of the deeper reservoirs, we're in the gas condensate phase, but right in the shallowest reservoirs in the upper Angua, I think we're probably in that volatile oil window, but it's hard to tell from mud gas data because it's not a virgin sample. It hasn't been captured at reservoir conditions. It's come up to surface, so it's, we're right on the borderline there. So,
well, maybe we'll pause there, and there's I think I'll pass it back to Jamie, and Jamie's going to ask you some questions around just mud and your choices with that, and then maybe more importantly, we'll move on to discussions of drilling and flow testing. But Jamie, I'll let you take over here.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched upon the mud choices, changing the chemistry, the mud weight. So maybe we won't dwell on it too much. But from your drone video, we can see you dug some mud pits. So you're probably using a water-based mud this time.
We are, and so we have brought on a new mud engineer for this program. So he was involved in the Lockachar campaign in Kenya with tallow and Africa oil. So he's reviewed all of our drilling data, the cuttings, the mud reports, and everything else. And and we did have a long, hard and think about, okay, well, what are we going to do with the mud system? Are we going to switch it up to a synthetic-based mud or an oil-based mud? Are we only going to do it for some of the reservoir sections? And his recommendation was that we can drill this with water-based mud. We just need to change up some of the chemistry, and that the mud is synthetic-based mud is, one, very expensive. Two, you've got to have all the supplies that you need when you need it. So you've got to pre-buy all of this, and it comes in barrels because it is actual or pre-made mud in barrels. Whereas with water-based mud, you mix it up by adding the chemicals into those reservoirs that you can see that we have put in place at the pad. So it's a much more manageable scenario from a water-based mud if you can get away with drilling with water-based mud, and we think we can. So, I mean, it doesn't preclude us from going to synthetic in the future, but I think just for this campaign, given the advice that we've had from someone who went through that Lockachar campaign and said, very similar in terms of the makeup of the geology, in terms of its type of geology, the clays that were encountered, that we can do this with water-based mud by changing some of the chemistry.
Cool. It's good that you brought that experience in from analogous basins. I guess let's move on to the spudding of the well. So it looks like you started moving the equipment to the new site. Are you on track to spud in, say, September or before the start of the dry season? The wet season. I think is October to March. Is that correct?
No, wet season. I mean, the first rains you generally get kind of end of November, and you'll get a few showers, and it doesn't really set in until kind of mid-December time. So we're well and truly within the dry season window here. So the rig move has started. That should complete probably early next week. Well, the move will conclude before that, but the rig up of everything will be done probably by early to mid next week. From there, we've got to do some acceptance testing of the rig and commissioning of the new mud tanks that have been brought in. Again, part of the challenge we had with the previous well was getting the mud tanks ready to deal with the mud weight that we were using. They were old. We needed to ensure that they weren't going to fail, given that the mud weight that we're using. The agitation system in it also wasn't ideal, so we got very inconsistent mud weights throughout the section, because when you're mixing up water-based mud, obviously you're adding chemicals to it, and if you imagine if the agitator system is not working properly, you get some bits that haven't dissolved properly in the mud, and some bits are lighter, which does create issues. So that's all now been replaced, and a brand new mud tank system has been brought in. So we'll get that commissioned and set up, and we've got to go through our rig acceptance testing and checklist to make sure that from a rig perspective everything's ready to drill before we accept that. The services, the new services that we have mobilized or brought in for this campaign, mud logging, so that should arrive. That units we brought in, again, part of the changes for this campaign have been to, we were very, I think the mud logging was one of the big letdowns from the last campaign, and we lost a lot of valuable information because the mud logging unit didn't perform in the previous well. So Geolog, who mud logging is their core business, that's what they do, and they're very, very experienced. So it's going to get the care and attention that it needs. So their unit should arrive end of August. So that's also got to get hooked up and set up. And then the other services are wireline, so that they're at the base at the moment. Those tools are being function checked, assessed, getting serviced. Our QA/QC people will then go in and check those before they depart, and they're already part of that servicing process at the moment, and checking that everything is getting done. And then the directional drilling equipment that starts to move pretty soon. A lot of that gets air freighted. So from a timing point of view, most of the stuff we're waiting for now is either on the water and close to getting into a port and then coming up to us, getting driven, or getting air freighted. So from a risk point of view of a spud date, everything's on track for probably around the mid-September at this point.
Okay. How long do you have the rig for, and do you have the option to extend if necessary?
We do have so we've got the rig for as long as we want it. So we did extend, put in place a contract extension with Exalo for this well. So we've got it for this well for as long as we like. What we've been also then, kind of looking at over the last few months is how does the program now pan out for next year and beyond that. And I think looking at the rig availability in the region, the effort that it takes to mobilize a rig and bring it in and get comfortable with it means that rig retention for us is paramount, and Exalo are happy to extend that. They've been a great company to work with, and we're really happy with them. So the rig has proven itself from a capability point of view. I think it performed better than we thought in terms of where we thought we'd be able to get to from a depth and a fork and drag perspective with the rig. So it's capable of drilling the depths that we require at the moment and performing as we require. So for the foreseeable future, we'd like to keep that rig in country, and Exalo are happy to keep it there. It's just really negotiating a contract extension now, and we're in progress with that at the moment. So
if you need to sidetrack Mukuyu-2, do you have plans for that if necessary? And then also, in a success case scenario, do you plan to abandon the well and flow test later and go off and drill another well somewhere else, or another prospect, or are you going to just put that on hold and go for the flow testing before drilling anything else?
So again, this is now we'll come to the strategy. I'll just address the sidetrack question first. So we've got, from a contingency point of view, we've got everything that we need. We probably have to order a little bit more mud, but we've got a mud supplier now that's based in South Africa, and that means we had to go to them in an emergency last year because the chemicals that we ordered from our service provider only turned up in December. So so we were using additional mud anyway from that. It's all the same stuff from a standards perspective and APIs. So that's been a cheaper and much easier solution to put in place. So that would probably be the only thing that's required. We've got enough bits, we've got enough casing, we've got enough, everything else is in track. We've got a specialist sidetrack bit as well now that we mowed for the previous well, but didn't end up using because we managed to kick it off after 4 attempts, I think, in trying to kick off because the cement job was poor, and we won't get into all of that now because we're getting sidetracked, pardon the pun. So we've got everything we need if we need to sidetrack, apart from some mud which we need to order, but that's not far away. It's a few days away by road, and you'd have to do a few things anyway before you'd need it. Then getting back to what we do with the well post drilling. So from a flow testing point of view, there's a number of ways we can do it, and depends on what we encounter. We've got a base idea of what we'd like to do, but again, we don't want to be too fixated. We've got some flexibility in how we preserve this well for flow testing. So the two options, we either run a 7-inch liner, so we'd run the liner, cement that in place, which means the well is essentially static and it can sit there for quite a long time. You'd then come back and perforate each of those zones, and you'd start at the bottom and then work your way up and test them individually. So that requires perforation guns. It requires a lot of packers to isolate each of those zones. You'd need test separator and all the well test package to be mobilized, so that you can do a proper flow test. It's not like a kind of onshore US scenario where it's pretty agricultural and you're just hooking it into a flow system that's nearby and they're testing, or into a tank. It's we're doing this to gather dynamic reservoir information. So and
you would need the rig. Would you need the rig for the flow test, or can you use?
You could use something like that, so depending on how you suspend it. So if we suspended it if we ran the liner and then come back and perforate it later, then you can use something smaller and lightweight, which we need to mobilize. A small little workover unit or coil tubing unit or a jacking platform. We used to use that in the Perth Basin for some of the stuff. So that would be a lot smaller, a lot more manageable than a rig. The other way to suspend it would be to basically plug it back to the 9 5/8 inch shoe, so above where we're planning to. Again, depends on what interval we're talking about here. I'm just talking about the lower section of the well here. You could plug it back to the shoe and then essentially sidetrack and re-drill that reservoir section again, and then you could come back and test it, and you do that straight away as soon as you finish drilling. So that's the other way to do it.
Do you have kind of a zone of interest, or is it kind of like trying to pick your favorite kid, or
Well, yeah. So we need to, and that's why we're not doing it immediately, because we need to go and basically analyze and get the right equipment in. If we're going to perforate it, we need to have, you've got to design the guns and the string and what kind of charge you're going to use, the phasing of it, get the test spread ready. So it's not onshore US. Yeah, we're a remote operation and it requires a lot of planning to do things properly. So
you're kind of
And we picked a zone of interest. Well testing is expensive as well, so you're not going to go and test. If it's 6 zones, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to test all 6. You'll go and prioritize your main ones. You might do 1, 2, or 3 at most. In my opinion, get that information, and then you might maybe you'll do a commingled one all at the end, because you want to test your individual zones and understand what your far field reservoir properties are telling you, permeability, connected volumes, rather than just a pure flow rate point of view. So you can test wells where you just, you want a headline number and you're not looking at anything else, or you can, you do a more thorough job of gathering your data properly, downhole gauges, shutting them in for periods to look at the buildups, understanding your connected volumes. So that does take a lot more time. It's a lot more expensive. And we then also need to have a look and see, moving into next year and into a future campaign, what that looks like, because keeping a rig and services on standby whilst you're doing a longer term test like that starts to get expensive, and it starts to make more sense then to have a much smaller unit where you're only looking at wireline perforating to do that. And then also, if our rig is tied up with well testing, that means we're not drilling as well. And we have a lot of drilling to do in this basin, and we can go through the wet season. It's not ideal, and it starts to get pretty messy and complicated with, depending on where we are in the basin and moving rigs and that side. So that's going to also form part of our broader strategy, is how are we going to effectively drill and test these wells going forward in a coordinated campaign, and also having a test spread on standby that you're kind of picking up and putting down and mobilizing people. Then you go and drill another well, and then you activate it again, or whether you do it in a kind of coordinated all-in testing campaign where you're just going around at the end once you've drilled all your wells, and then you're going on a dedicated campaign. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's just a question of logistics and cost and time.
Going back to the fluid samples, is there an absolute minimum volume you need to recover to say we have a discovery? Like, is it one of these 450cc chambers, or is it, you mentioned 2 to 3?
No, so you just need one of them. So
okay. And is that per zone, or can you just say this well is a discovery if you have one filled chamber?
If you've got one filled chamber and you've got you've proven that you can have movable hydrocarbons out of the rock and flow it by getting a sample, and then you've got the same log responses at other zones, which is what we have now. We've got the log responses that demonstrate we've got hydrocarbon bearing reservoir, but we just don't have a fluid sample to show for it. So you can then say, well, these other ones are also a discovery, and we've got X zones that are within this closure and structure and this. So you can do it from a reporting point of view. That's something that we'd be comfortable doing, because I think you don't have to go and get a sample out of every single zone to prove that you have hydrocarbons in every single zone. You need to show that you can get it out of one that's within the same grade of structure, same formation, same stratigraphic interval. I think moving to a different stratigraphic interval, you need to kind of prove that differently. So say if we were in the Dandy versus the Upper Angua, I think that would require probably 2 or a sample from each of them. And the minimum volume question, I mean, it's just a function of the size of the sample chambers. So that's it'll be a minimum of 450 cc's. You just fill them up and then that's it. So
I imagine people are going to want to know quickly, we often get questions about, is this a commercial well, versus it being a commercial prospect, which takes a number of wells plus flow testing. show to move towards reserves. So realistically, you can still declare a discovery, but it might be several months to years before you can book reserves, as it were. That's my understanding. Or do you think you could do it quicker?
Your reserves booking is a function of, and the size of it is the amount of information that you have and certainty that you can project away from your well control. So, for example, with SEC rules in the US, you're only allowed to book your reserves in a limited area around your wellbore. You can't project away from your well across the structure. Certainly not going into another fault block. So booking reserves comes at a time where it's mature enough from a data acquisition point of view to provide you with some certainty across a particular area. You can do it for a smaller area in the field, but you can't just go from one well and say, well, we've got 10 TCF or 20 TCF across the field. You can't do that because you don't have the data to prove the continuity of your reservoir, continuity of your fluids, and it's the same type of fluid from certainly not in a structure the size of Mukuyu. So to get to a reserves point of view, you then also got to have typically commercial contracts in place. You've got to have certainty of development. You've got to have line of sight to your licenses being granted. So there's all of those considerations that come into a reserves booking. You can certainly do a resources booking, which is contingent resources, which means it's contingent on either some kind of commercial aspect, some technology aspect. So it'll come in those phases where it'll go to contingent resources and then it'll go to reserves. I think the other important aspect from a commerciality declaration, most production sharing agreements, most concession agreements, there's a very important mechanism in there where once you declare it commercial, you're on the clock to develop it. So you'll often see companies that will provide you with every indication that it's commercial, but they'll stop short of declaring it a commercial discovery, because then you've got to get on with your development plan, and your development plan or your development and your production window is, depending on which jurisdiction you're operating in, is 15, 20, 25 years, 30 years sometimes. So you don't want to eat up some of that by prematurely, before you're ready to get the development kicked off by declaring it commercial, and then you're eating into some of that window. So we'll probably have a similar situation because we've got a language trigger in our agreements as well.
Okay. I think Matthew has some few questions on resources.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I'm going to back up just one moment here, and just a question that, again, I think is maybe just for posterity's sake for people that lots of people asked it, and I'm sure it's one that you've been asked yourself a number of times. I mean, I think that you articulated your argument well, or your reasoning well about why a deliberate sort of steadfast approach to flow testing makes more sense, for a junior such as yourself, and being wise with your resources and such. Obviously, I'm going to guess you've met with some consternation from investors where people are hoping for a faster turnaround in terms of flow testing from the drill. I guess maybe the question I have for you: Are there legitimate concerns in there in terms of the turnaround, or is that just what you would maybe suggest is this kind of impatient market followers, maybe just kind of wanting things fast?
Look, it is. I think the expectation of us drilling and testing immediately is a bit much to ask for the state that we're in now. I think, again, compared to a lot of our investors have had experience, maybe in other jurisdictions, in Australia, in the US, and wherever else. This, again, we've only drilled one well in the basin. We've got a remote operation, a remote location. We don't have any supply bases from a service company point of view where you can just call up and say, okay, we want to drill and test, and things are on standby. So all of those play a factor in the lead times in what we're doing. So, in the Perth Basin, which is 400 k's away from here, you've got a supply base up in Karratha, you've got some of the supply bases down here in Perth. All of the service companies are there. You've got 2 rigs in the basin. If you need anything, you're not dealing with any customs importation, crossing borders. You've got personnel at your fingertips. This is a logistics project with some drilling in the middle of it. So the logistics aspect of this is enormous. The drilling's, Ryan, our new drilling manager, who's come on board, and again, we've had some changes on the drilling team as well. He's, from a drilling point of view, in his view, it's the simplest part of what we're doing. We're not too concerned. It's the logistics aspect and the lead times, getting contracts in place with the vendors and service companies has taken a long time for this early part of where we are. But once we can give everyone certainty that they need from a market point of view, from everywhere else, that we can then start planning much longer term, bigger campaigns, multi-well, across several years as well, you'll then start to see those service providers be able to set up and service us better from where they can supply tools. Because if you look at the logistics component, okay, we're getting sets of tools for this well, but in between them, how do you service them? If you need to replace them, where does that come from? They don't have any supply bases. Everything's got to go back to Angola or Gabon or Pemba in Mozambique or the UAE, Gulf of Mexico. It's really hard to get and if you're missing one of those things, it holds up your entire operation, because you can't, it's a very integrated operation. You can't just pick and choose. So the logistics aspect is really hard. So as I said, once we get past this next well, everything going well, we'll be able to then plan a lot better, and we can get better contracts in place with our service providers as well. Invictus doesn't have a real track record. Zimbabwe doesn't have a track record from a jurisdiction point of view. So a lot of these service companies, it's taken a lot to get them over the line to do it, but they can see now longer term work on the horizon. So this time around, it's been much easier as well, and it'll get easier as everyone gets more familiar with it. So we've also got some seasonal considerations as well. So we don't want to start getting a little bit too clever at this point and getting ourselves stuck. This pad, though, is all weather. The road is all weather. So when we built Mukuyu-1, we were supposed to spud in May or June. We should have been done well before the rainy season kicked in, and it just didn't happen. And we didn't design the runoff to do it. It was a completely flat pad, and we didn't have as much gravel in the pad construction. Whereas now Mukuyu-2, again, we've refined it, gotten better, and so future drilling pads as well are going to be better and better access as well. So that'll also help us keep everything busy for more of the year than necessarily we would.
No, thank you. And yeah, I think that just provides some color for people that are just obviously anxious and excited, right? I'm going to switch gears here. And again, we're kind of now here we are, post Mukuyu-2. I guess, but maybe this one actually kind of straddles the pre and post Mukuyu-2. Updated resource estimates. Is this a matter? I mean, do you plan to provide an updated prospective recoverable resource estimate for the basin prospects based on incoming data prior to the next well? Is that something that is your intention, or what's your thoughts around the next resource estimate?
So from are you talking about the basin margin prospect, or are you talking about just the basin in general?
Well, I guess both, right? But yeah, I mean, we can get granular or macro, yeah, right? But,
Okay. So,
Well,
so from a
sorry, there was some of the prospects in the east of the basin had some new seismic shot over them. So like Mopane, Mazuma,
Yep.
etc. And some of those don't have volumes associated with them that I've seen.
So we've just finished that acquisition. So that data is now getting processed, and then we've got to interpret it, and then we'll provide some numbers once we've then map the prospects. We've done the estimates, and we'll again we'll go through that process again of putting out numbers. So that's probably something that'll only happen at some stage next year once we've done that. The seismic processing will probably take until, I would guess, end of November at this point of view, based on what happened last time and the amount of data that we have. And then we've got to interpret it and do all of the rest and integrate the data then from Mukuyu-1 and Mukuyu-2 into those. So from a stepping back then to Mukuyu-1 and that prospective resource estimate and the basin margin ones, the way that we went about those estimates and the independent numbers was really then, rather than try and pick an individual section within the seismic and say, well, that's where our reservoir is and what it's going to be, we took a very, very simple approach where we said, let's use the Upper Angler as an example, where we said, based on the outcrop, we've seen 25 to 50 meter, sometimes 100 meter thick reservoir sections. Our estimate is going to be using the reservoir properties of this range. So again, we did a probabilistic range. We just gave it a net reservoir interval of 25 meters in the Upper Angler, right? And you project that across. So we've got a more complicated, obviously, scenario now with the number of reservoirs we have, the different depths that they're at, the type of depositional environment that we're in being fluvial. So you then, now to project where we are from Mukuyu-1 across the entire structure and say, okay, well, we know in a fluvial environment, some of those reservoirs are going to come and go. You're going to get some that end up being stacked, whether you encounter the same stack channel on the other side of the structure, probably unlikely. So it becomes very difficult to project what you saw from Mukuyu-1 across the entire structure, because it's not, from a depositional point of view, that's not valid. So once we drill a few wells then, and some 3D seismic, that will certainly help us as well. We're just dealing with, it's still a relatively coarse grid from a 2D perspective, but more well control. And 3D will then be able to put together contingent resources and then an updated prospective resource estimate as well for the stuff that the blocks that we haven't drilled in the structure. And you'll see this across other companies. Some of them will have a 2P, a 2C, and a 2U estimate in the same structure. So so that's reserves, resources, contingent resources, and prospective resources. The stuff that's in the structure, undiscovered, you can't lay claim to it because you don't have well control in that block or whatever the case is. So that's ultimately where we get to, and again, projecting average reservoir properties across the basin and the structure, that's also a little bit immature at this stage. From getting back to my favorite, the Perth Basin, typically you haven't seen companies update their resources estimates until they've drilled 2 or 3 wells at least.
Yeah, good. And I think that you're providing that context that people are looking for. If I could be so bold and to follow this up now that you've it's immature and data lacking to make these sort of decisions. But if I could put you on the hot spot, then obviously if it's too early or there's not enough data, then you can say so. But are we moving closer? Do you think just based on your preliminary understanding, are we moving closer to P10, P90, or are we around that P50 zone in terms of what the pre-drill resource estimate was?
Yeah, It's a tough question, Matt, and it's really around the column heights that we're looking at now, because if we don't know where we are in terms of free water levels for these structures. We couldn't get because of the issues that we had getting pressure data because of the my mind's just gone. The filter cake that we had on the inside of the borehole. So we couldn't get pressure gradients through that, which would have helped us get a rough idea of what the column heights could have been, and that's going to be a major variable in the estimates of your resource. If we're kind of filter spill in the columns, and we've got a series of stacked reservoirs, even if they're individual, that starts to become pretty material. If they're much smaller individual compartments, then they're obviously going to be at the lower end of the spectrum. So we can't tell until we start to get pressure data across there. And I think it's just we don't have the maturity at this point to say where we are from a range. Are we tending towards the P90 or the P50 or the P10?
Yeah, absolutely valid, right? I think understandably, everyone is excited and just eager to see this kind of long-standing years of work come to fruition, just as you are, right? So maybe I'll switch gears here. We're kind of nearing the end of it here, a bit of a grabbing at the end here. Just discussing farm-in or JVs, right? I mean, this is, of course, a much bandied about conversation as well. I guess maybe a couple of questions just around the variables involved, I suppose, in the process. I mean, one of my questions was like, what's the ideal moment? I mean, I think that's kind of a silly question, maybe, but maybe more to the point, maybe I'll ask this instead. How much does the sample to surface actually change things for potential partners, right? I mean, that, the market didn't give you much credit because you couldn't get the fluid sample to surface. But you've articulated yourself well that there's been a tremendous technical success. I mean, are prospective partners waiting on? Maybe the question I'm actually asking you is how much data is left to get filled in for you to start getting serious offers that you consider to be fair value? Maybe that's the question I'm actually trying to ask you here.
Yeah, I think from the serious offer and fair value things are kind of related, because you might have something that is an offer from a recognized partner, but maybe you don't think as a company reflects fair value. So do you regard it as a serious offer or just tire kicking? So they're kind of related, but I think demonstrating movable hydrocarbons, obviously, and a discovery that does then open up, I think, particularly with the materiality of our portfolio, controlling the running room in the basin, that's something that is then attractive to all companies, because it's got that repeatability in running room, as we have highlighted in our presentations in the Lockjaw basin, using that as an example. Once you prove it, it's as close to shooting fish in a barrel as you can get from an oil and gas perspective. So that means you're converting your prospective resources then into contingent resources and reserves becomes a lot higher. You're not having to risk it as hard as you were, and obviously the value then goes through the roof. So that will definitely change. I think we've already had conversations with a number of parties, and there were some who were keen on potentially joining us in this next round in this coming campaign. But we felt that we could really deliver a step change in the value of the company and the asset by completing Mukuyu-1 and being able to prove that movable hydrocarbons are present in Mukuyu, and then obviously you infer that across a large part of the basin as well, now that we've proven that it works. So that from a timing point of view, sometimes you can't control the timing. Companies sometimes are on the lookout, and they see something that suits what they like, and then become something that it can happen pretty quickly, or you can run a process and do it in a more kind of methodical way once you put together all the data and everything else. And if you run an open process, that can also then drive some competition and deliver more value in that manner. So at some stage, we are going to bring a partner, and we can't continue to fund all of this activity all ourselves. The timing of when you bring a partner in and the value that you realize, again, is dependent on what the maturity of it is, so how much data you have, which then generally goes to the risk perception that you have. So if it's earlier stage, the companies that are farming in will risk it harder than if you've drilled 5 wells and flow tested them and everything looks great. So but then you've got to spend more money to do that as the operator so it is a balancing act of when you do it. So the later you do it, and providing things turn out as you anticipate, obviously you can drive the value higher, but that's then balanced against how do you fund all of that activity as well. So
do you have
never going to be perfect.
Do you have a structured kind of formal JV process underway, or is it more, you're focusing on exploration right now?
Yeah, we're focused on the campaign, and I think we discussed this at the board level as we'd had some inquiries, do we open this up to a process again? And I think unanimous in that what we needed to do was go and drill Mukuyu-2, and to keep the team focused on the operations and the campaign, and because it is a big effort to Jamie, I'm sure you've been involved in these processes as well. It's a big effort to get everything ready, and we were still digesting data from Mukuyu-1 as well, and that that's a live and evolving story as well when you're doing it. So it was a lot of work to get everything ready for Mukuyu-1, and if you're running a process at the same time, it would have distracted everyone. So we've put it on hold until post Mukuyu-2.
I think no, thank you, Jimmy. Yeah, I think you're kind of anticipating questions here. I can't help but ask as a follow-up. I mean, you've explained yourself well, that data is king, obviously, right? And then I think that dovetails nicely to the conversation as to why Mukuyu-2 is where it is, right? You're trying to gain basin mastery as quickly as possible, as you yourself has referenced. And this is going to be an impossible question where I'm going to ask you to predict where other people might be, their heads might be at. So, I mean, just, bear with me or play along. But, I mean, where are we at, right? I mean, when do you think that the data mastery of the basin becomes serious enough that you, again, predicting other people's movements here, so this is all hypothetical, but is it another well, is it another 2 wells, 2D, you have to get a more finer good with your 2D, start getting 3D in there. I mean, at what point do you achieve critical mass, I suppose, in your perspective, I guess?
Look, I think certainly 3D is a part of that. And as I mentioned in last year pre-drill, that we were chasing big material structures. We didn't need 3D to image them and prove whether there were hydrocarbons there and structure there. We're chasing stuff where it's big enough that it's material, and if you can't image it on 2D, you shouldn't be chasing it at that point, right? That then changes. So it's a crude tool, but it's good enough to be doing what we need to do now. Into the future, then, when you're planning your development wells, trying to understand your reservoir connectivity, because we've got multiple horizons, that then becomes important. So with that and being able to then calibrate your wells to your seismic data, that 3D is crucial, because you've just got a much better handle on the continuity of it and the connectivity of it. So I think post 3D and post another 1 or 2 wells, you can start to then have a bit of confidence away from your well control. Having said that, in the subsurface and in this game, you always get surprises. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. And, you're never going to have perfect data. You're never going to have basin mastery. That's a fact. You're never going to understand fully what happens. And, even on your reserves estimates, that's why you have P90, P10 and P50 estimates, because you just cannot predict it with any certainty. And sometimes those are really wide ranges. But the more data you have, the narrower those ranges should get. But that data costs money to go and acquire. So you're never going to have basin mastery. You may think you do, but it'll come and bite you at some stage. And, even in Waitsia, the field that I used to work in, Waitsia 10 that they drilled, dry hole within that field. So that was after, and that was for a particular reason. Where it was up close against the faults, and there was always that risk. But you never, even after all of that, you're going to have some surprises, and you're never going to master it. Carnarvon with Buffalo redevelopment, attic oil, drilled it in, really well defined, but still. So you do need all of those tools: well control, 3D, and even then, it's still a tough game. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah,
it's just a fact.
Yeah, I think that's about as well as I can probably have hoped for. No, it was a difficult question, absolutely. And I guess maybe I'll switch gears here. Like I say, we're down to the nitty gritty here, 3 or 4 more subtopics. Kind of greatest hits here again. PPSA, obviously, long-standing conversation here. Scott, you and I had a decent conversation about it last week on the phone when we were planning this conversation. I just thought, again, I think that a lot of energy is spent on retail boards concerned about PPSA and the lack of it being finalized and done and officially made official, I suppose. I guess, do you just want to take that? I mean, again, I know this is something that you've probably talked about many times, but I mean, how real is this concern? Should people be wasting or using as much energy as they do want it? And I guess maybe what are the pre-existing terms without the PPSA? If you move forward without it, what are the terms that you are operating under?
So yeah, I think there's a lot of concern that comes from a lot of shareholders on the PPSA, and it's because it's something that we flagged that is important, and it is in the long run. But I think there is a lot of emphasis and energy wasted on it being in place at the moment. So we operate under a concession arrangement, which is a royalty tax agreement, and we can operate all the way through to production under that current system. We don't have to have a PPSA in place. It's something that we voluntarily put in place with the government so that they can take a share of not only the profit, but also the product, which is important. In the scheme of things, because of what's happened in some of the other mineral sectors in Zim. It will happen, and that's the only way also that the government can back into this and get their equity share in the project and gain anything besides royalty and tax. At the moment, it's the best fiscal regime on the planet. 2% royalty on gas, 0 on oil, and corporate tax. So if it's not in place, we actually gain. But this is the right thing to do, and it's going to happen eventually.
Yeah, and so maybe, I mean, again, I just asking you to theorize about the machinations of other people and other organizations, but I mean, what is the holdup? I mean, now we're butting up a week away from another election, and I'll ask you about that here in a moment too. But I mean, is it just, I guess, can you provide any color whatsoever in terms of why the can's getting kicked? Seems to be, is it getting kicked is that a fair assessment? I mean, people maybe are concerned. Of course, jurisdiction is a concern. I mean, there's lots of reasonable explanations as to why Zimbabwe as a jurisdiction is maybe worth people's time and money, right, in terms of risk assessment. But I mean, is it fair to say people are concerned it's becoming a political issue, right? And so, and I think that's understandable. Can you just shedding color or shed some light on that conversation, right, around, is it a political football? Has the can been kicked? And, those concerns regarding this political football that maybe people are concerned about.
Sure. I don't think it's a political football that's been kicked around. Everyone wants this in place. Certainly with the government, it's wanted, and from some of the NGO groups within the region and in Zimbabwe also want it in place, because at the end of the day, it's about transparency and accountability from both from an investor point of view, which is us, and also from a government point of view to its citizens, because everyone wants to see that when the resource is developed, that those benefits that it benefits the nation and not just Invictus or a handful of people in government. So we all want the same thing. And I had to point this out to a couple of NGO groups that were, have postulated that it would end up in the same manner that we've seen the diamond trade end up in Zimbabwe at one point, where only a handful of people benefit. Oil and gas is very different because you've got the transportability issue with it. Diamonds are very small, highly portable. Oil and gas is not. And we are a public company. We're completely transparent and open. I think we put out far more information than most companies do from all aspects, whether it's technical, whether it's operational. We put out a lot of information. Some of the other, I guess, aspects to that are there are a lot of, and I don't want to point out nationalities of any particular groups, but there are a lot of government-controlled companies that operate in the region that don't have any of that transparency or accountability. So with a resource like this and that is being operated by a company like Invictus, there is a far more accountability, transparency that is typically present in these ventures. And so I think that's also what has become apparent, is that everyone's a lot more comfortable now with Invictus in this position. We used to get a lot of flack about, you guys are a small company, what are you going to do? How are you going to develop this? And we've proven everyone wrong. If I'd stopped when people started telling me to stop doing this, and almost immediately, like 12 years ago, when this first happened, and even more recently, everyone told us we couldn't drill any wells, we'd never be able to do this. You're wasting your time. There's no oil and gas in this basin. We've proven everyone wrong, and and I think we're being taken seriously now in all quarters, whether it's government, whether it's opposition, NGOs. I think we've proven ourselves and our capability. And we've sidetracked a little bit here, but the reason that this has taken longer than probably people would like, and certainly than we would have liked, is that there's been a couple of evolutions of this. It's been through 2 independent reviews. The Sovereign Wealth Fund then got involved last year when we did this deal for the additional acreage to cover the basin margin and some of that stuff in the east. They had someone that was appointed this year, and we were confident of it getting done. And that about 2 months ago, that's now changed, where there's a new. We've been told who it is, and we'd be a very well-known individual once they're in the chair from the Sovereign Wealth Fund, because they are a signatory to this agreement. Until that point, the chair and the CEO role at the Sovereign Wealth Fund have now been vacated. And that will only now be fulfilled post-election once everything is completed. So once that's done, they've then gone through the independent, well, they're comfortable with the reviews and the comments. The fiscal terms are all agreed and everyone's happy. It's just some few little nitty gritty bits and pieces from a lawyer, typical lawyer stuff, arguing about vocabulary and definitions in some of the agreement. And so there's nothing material that is going to get changed. It's really just the new bodies in the Sovereign Wealth Fund being comfortable with the agreement and being a party to it, because no one wants to sign an agreement that they don't understand or be comfortable with. I think that's also been a fear that is not unreasonable on government's part, is that no one in government really has understood what a production sharing agreement is, what's supposed to be in it, is it fair and balanced, and that's why it's had all of these independent reviews done, so that at least, because this is backed by statute, it's backed by the laws of the country, that once it's done, then that's it. There's no turning back. So they wanted to be sure that this agreement is fair for the government and for the people, and that there's nothing untoward in it, and that they're not signing something that is going to deprive the nation of or be an unfair agreement in the future, because it will last, many years. So this is something that's going to be in place for 25 to 30, 40, 50 years that will operate under.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any concerns about one moment here, are there any risks involved where you announce a discovery without a PPSA in place? Does that add any complicating factors that, as you progress things towards commerciality, is there a potential for complications that arise, or no?
No, we don't believe so. There are coal bed methane projects that are in production in Zimbabwe that operate under the current framework that we have, and those provisions are in the law for us to do so. So we can go and apply for a production license, we pay a royalty, and we pay tax, and that's it. So everything is there for us to go through that. So yeah, nothing would add to that risk of us making a discovery. In fact, I think it will speed things along, to be honest, because the only means then of government getting its equity share under the agreement that we have with the Sovereign Wealth Fund and how we've negotiated this is for the production sharing agreement to get signed. So at the moment, when we first drafted the agreement, there was no government participation at all. It was just a pure production sharing agreement where there was no government equity. Now, because of the deal that we did with the Sovereign Wealth Fund to expand that license area so that we had that basin master position, that's been now brought into the new agreement too. So effectively, that's the only way that they get equity and get any of the production sharing benefits either. Otherwise, just a very low royalty and corporate tax.
Okay, good. No, thank you. And then this will be kind of 1 foot in the PSA conversation and 1 foot moving towards the elections here. But I mean, again, obviously political risk. I mean, this is, like you say, you've been on this for 12 years. You understand why people have some reservations regarding Zimbabwe as a jurisdiction in terms of investing there based on history. Obviously, from the Western perspective, you have the liberal-Tory divide where, if you are a resource investor, you're obviously kind of rooting for the Tories because they typically traditionally more favorable or friendly to that sort of resource industries. And so obviously I understand that that's not necessarily the case in all, other countries. Politics are much more complex or unique to the local kind of needs. Is there a similar divide? I mean, Mnangagwa doesn't get reelected, ZANU don't get reelected. Obviously it hasn't happened yet, but I mean, how much of a spanner does that throw in the works for you? I mean, does the opposition party oppose to this sort of work, or where are they at ideologically? I mean, what are the concerns here? We're just a week away.
So from a, and all companies in the sector, deal with this in every jurisdiction that you operate in, whether it's Australia, whether it's the US, UK. These are long-term projects, and you've got to be able to do business with the government of the day. And governments change, and it's, given the scale of this and the longevity that it'll have, it's highly likely that we will deal with a change of government at some stage. I think it's pretty rare for one political party to be, that would be then by the end, you're coming up to something like 75 years probably, which is pretty rare. Certainly the party would have changed anyway by then, and compared to the original founders of it. So you've got to be able to do business with the government of the day, whether that's the opposition currently or a new opposition party in the future. It doesn't matter. I think we don't get involved in politics over there because, as I said, we need to be able to. We're not picking sides. We need to be able to do business with any government that's in power. But previously we've had conversations with who are in the current opposition party. This was back in 2018, where it was the first election happened after the change in government, and they are pro resource as well. I think everyone now recognizes that this is a project that will have a material impact on the shape of the economy, and every government is going to want to utilize it and ensure that it's not stymied, it's not held up, so that, because it is a real silver bullet for the economy, particularly from an energy perspective, and power is in acute deficit not only in Zimbabwe but in the rest of the region as well, and it's really hampering the economy, and so we don't have any concerns if there is a change in government that it's going to come with any threat to our project or our operations.
No, thank you. And then two more. We'll touch on helium and then just a development and work program conversation, and that'll be it. Almost at the 2 hour mark here, so I'll try to be quick here. Helium. Obviously, it was kind of a funny little update when it happened, right? Kind of an added wrinkle or a little bonus. Just so kind of a general conversation, just an update on a color you can provide, when we might know more, things you've learned from the lab or things that you've learned since drilling. And I'll pause there and then I'll ask my second question afterwards, but getting any update there? Yeah,
so look, the helium angle, to be honest, we weren't surprised with, because the basin has the geological ingredients to generate helium. What was an unknown was what kind of quantities and concentrations it would be in. So pre-drill, we actually did quite a lot of investigation into, how do we sample for it? What do we need to do? And we came to the conclusion that, we kind of needed to focus on the hydrocarbon aspect first. And, if helium's there, then it's we don't know if it is going to be in commercial concentration. So we're not going to kind of worry ourselves with it at the moment, because helium is one of the smallest particles around, and it does escape, and so to sample it, we would have had to get some copper tubes to store it in, because it can escape because of the pore sizes in glass. It can actually escape out of glass. So we just decided it was too hard for what we were doing with Mukuyu-1. So then when we got the mud gas samples, and one of my dealers, why are you so obsessed with helium? And so, well, it's a nice little bonus. And you do get in 97% of the world's helium production comes out of hydrocarbon hosted heliums as a byproduct, because and you will find helium in most oil and gas fields. It's just a question of the concentration, but in most of them, it doesn't exist in concentrations that warrant processing it to put the energy in to separate it out, because it's just the juice is not worth the squeeze, basically. and often companies don't even test for it as well. That's quite often too, where you're not looking for helium, and you've got to specifically request it from the lab to to make sure that they're looking at it with the chromatography. So we did. One of my jurors was saying, well, why are we doing this? And when we sent the mud gas away, it's like, oh, well, we've had, these are in isotubes. Are we going to have it? It's probably escaped. We didn't even know if we were going to get anything out of the isotubes because we had such an issue with the mud logging unit and that sampling system. We didn't know if we were even going to get valid results out of it. So that was a pleasant surprise to have it in the concentrations that we have it. So, it is something now that we're not focused on it, but it is a really nice byproduct. It's really, really valuable, and it's at concentrations that make sense to process it once you're producing gas. But fortunately, what we're looking at now is, because it is hydrocarbon hosted, you've got enough energy in the processing of your gas to warrant extracting it. If you look at pure play helium exploration, where it's hosted by carbon dioxide or nitrogen as your carrier gas, that then requires diesel or something else as an energy source to burn. And it also doesn't accumulate in, if you think about hydrocarbon source rocks generating and migrating, and you start to charge your reservoirs and displace your water leg, you can't generate helium in enough quantities to have big pools of it and big accumulations of it. So that's why hydrocarbon hosted helium is 97% of the world's production, because it comes as a byproduct, not as a primary thing that you're chasing.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. No, and I think you kind of answered my follow-up question. I mean, I get the sense that helium is extremely challenging and opaque, not just to produce and to sell, right? That the market is a challenging thing. And so I sometimes find that this is just me editorializing that explore codes that are struggling with finding hydrocarbons will start to bandy about and then champion their helium, right? So to me, it becomes a bit of a distraction where that if you've drilled a duster, you can start saying you're exploring helium. So I guess maybe not so much a question here as just a comment. It's you say that after the gas has been developed, after your primary targets have kind of been commercialized in a hypothetical world, you then turn around and start looking at because all the massive amounts of infrastructure required for helium. So no, I guess that's just, I was going to ask you about, do you think it's a distraction? I guess it was the question I was going to ask you, a distraction, but it sounds like you've already fairly definitively answered no, if that's a...
It's not a distraction, because it comes as a byproduct. So as long as we're producing gas, your helium will come along with it, and you can separate it out. You can liquefy it. To bolt on something like that is very, very cheap from a helium point of view, and you can put it in ISO containers and send it away. You'll always find a market for it. So yeah, I've had a lot of questions about it and saying, why don't we focus more on it? Well, as long as we're focused on the hydrocarbons aspect, the helium comes for free. So
yeah, perfect. Well said. No, good enough. And so last question here, and then again, thank you here. We're just nicely tapping past the deadline here. Just future development plans, future work programs moving forward. I guess maybe the question I'll start off with here, just to end this final subtopic, is right that we're seeing one well drilled a year, which I think people understand for a small explorer, kind of part and parcel. But I also think you understand that that's probably not going to be sufficient to develop this in a manner that makes people money in a timely fashion, right? So I guess when might we see that acceleration to a more meaningful scale? And I guess what will that take? Is it just as simple as JV, or what will it take to actually see the drill programs and development programs escalate to create value in a more rapid fashion, I guess?
Sure. So all going well with Mukuyu-2, and assuming success, the acceleration will come pretty quickly. So the planning will start immediately, and that will be in place for next year, where we can start to ramp up activity and put together multi-well campaigns. At the moment, we would like to put, and we've got the inventory from a location point of view, exploration targets point of view. We could go out and drill. We could put together more programs. A question of funding, really. So, and we thought that proving up Mukuyu-1 would then lead to a re-rate in value, which would increase our ability to fund it and attract a better deal from a farming point of view from partners. So the activity point of view and timing aspect of it will ramp up next year, and it's a function of funding for us. I think we've proved the ability to move very quickly. We acquired this license in 2018. We reprocessed the data, interrupted by COVID, shot infill seismic. We were still interpreting it when we committed to drilling a well. And then, we drilled a well inside of 4 years from that acquisition, and had at least 18 months interrupted by COVID. From a basin that's never been drilled before, a country that's never been done it before, that is very, very quick. So I think that, we prove we can move fast, and we probably move faster than a lot of potential partners would be comfortable with as well. A lot of people, particularly in bigger companies, love data. Obviously, you love data, but you've got to go and acquire it. It takes time. And the risk-based decision-making is easy to say, oh, well, we need some more data before we go and drill any wells. A lot of, we're not of that view. I think we take risk-based decisions of where we're going to drill it and how we're going to do it. And as I said, if I'd listened to everyone who told me to stop, we would have never have even got the license. So, you got to be persistent. You've got to believe in what you're doing and chase time, be dogged in doing it. Provided we get the support for funding in the form of market support. And, I think that's one thing I have neglected to mention at the start of this podcast, is we've been hugely fortunate with our shareholder base that we've had the support to go and do this, and not many companies get that. And, I'm very, very conscious of that and extremely grateful, because, what we're doing is hard, and it's hard enough just from an operational perspective, but the market's also been fairly tough, particularly over the last year. But we've had the support from shareholders who, also believe in this project and believe in what we're doing and have supported us. And that, that is amazing. And I'm, very, very grateful, and it still blows me away. So I think getting past Mukuyu to delivering what we hope, I think that the doors will open for us. And there's a lot of people watching this, and we'll be able to go and, I think, get different sources of funding as well. That door will also open from us, where it's not a pure, equity scenario. From some of the funds and retail, we'll have a lot of funding options. I think that will open for us in a number of different avenues, and partnering as well. So we'll be able to then put together multi-well campaigns, testing, 3D, upsize data acquisition, whole core, and that will come around quicker than people think. I mean, the one well a year thing has been just a function of the remote location and having to eat an elephant one piece at a time. It's you can't swallow the whole thing at once, and this is something that is we've had to take I guess a pragmatic approach to, because our funding isn't unlimited, and so we've got to make sure that we're making the right decisions and at the right time. But that'll change, I think, once we deliver what people are looking for.
Glory be the day where finances don't decide your exploration strategy, eh?
Oh, yeah. What a luxury.
So maybe one more here, and I apologize. There's a couple of questions I'm not going to get to, but I'll end on this one maybe. And just if you had to pick right now, just to tie up this idea of future work programs, based on your knowledge right now, based on the data you have in your possession right now, where would you be heading next for the number 3?
It's a very good question, and something that we're kind of wrestling with at the moment as well, because it's a luxury of having, I guess, a lot of optionality in the portfolio. So, I mean, we haven't even talked about the basin margin yet, and that's still something that's sitting and hasn't been tested. The stuff in the east that we're maturing now with the seismic, we'll get a good look at that once the data has been processed and how that shapes up. We see some very interesting amplitude supported leads from the old data, from the mobile data, which we're quite excited about. So whether you now then kind of move to extend Mukuyu as a play to the east, whether you go and test a new play in the basin margin that hasn't been done, which has a lot of running room in itself, and some appraisal with Mukuyu, we're working through that at the moment. So I think regardless of what happens with Mukuyu 2, we've still got a lot of running room in the rest of the basin to go and chase as well. So I think that's also important to articulate as well, that the basin works from a hydrocarbon perspective. There are hydrocarbons in the basin. Not everything that you drill is going to work. Your chance of success goes up, and once you've proven, as we demonstrated in our presentation that was released, once it works, it's then down to an individual prospect level. It's still early, but I think we've had a fantastic start, and the running room now in the basin is there to be chased. And so what you're going to see with a multi-well campaign is probably a combination where we will probably go and extend the play and try and drill some of the stuff in the east. We'll probably go and shoot some 3D next year. Well, more than likely, we'll shoot 3D next year in Mukuyu, or over Mukuyu, and then whether we wait until that's done before we select a Mukuyu drilling location, we're having that debate as well internally. So that leaves you then with because we've got a rig there, the ability to go and test one of the basin margin prospects. So we're also going to do a review of that now that we've got more information and post Mukuyu 2, again, able to better calibrate that. So we're updating our basin modeling at the moment as well. We're getting some good indications in the basin margin and the Dandy as well. There's some information that we're just working through at the moment that's come in, which is really interesting. And again, in Mukuyu-1, with the mud logging challenges that we had, where we didn't get any mud gas data through, basically until the upper Angwa in both the main bore and the sidetrack. That left us with a lot of uncertainty in the upper reservoir, because that gives you indications of whether you've had migration through in the upper levels. So we've done some analysis of some of the cuttings in some of those upper reservoirs, and we're just working through that now. And that, I think, also is going to be pointing us to go and chase the basin margin play as well. So we were always concerned about source and charge in the upper stuff and in the basin margin, given the fetch area of Mukuyu and what that means, and this has added a little bit more back into our belief in that and chasing that further, and that it is going to become a really material play in its own right. So yeah, long-winded way of saying we still haven't decided, but I think you're going to see a combination of all of those things, which is great. It means we've got a lot to choose from, and we're not we're not drilling wells because we don't have an option of where to go, where you're pigeonholed into, if you've only got a couple of prospects in your portfolio, sometimes you're drilling them just for the sake of it to fill some activity. And you never want to get into a scenario where you're just drilling wells to fill rig slots because you've made commitments. We can go and test stuff that's new and stuff that will open up further running room, and that's great to have. So.
No, great. Thank you, Scott. And honestly, I think we're at the end here. Jamie, do you have anything that you want to ask Scott before we tie things up?
No, just thanks again for your time. It's great chatting to you again.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And Scott, I'll turn it to you. Last chance to final words.
Yeah, I think again, just to reiterate, thanks to everyone who's been with us in the journey. We've had some long-standing shareholders and some more recent ones who've become aware of this and are excited by the opportunity. I think Invictus and our portfolio is relatively unique in the junior space. It's not often that you have a company that has this sort of materiality in their portfolio, the running room that we have, and the results that we've had from our very first well in the campaign, and now leading into the next one, and being able to get that support from our shareholders to continue this, so that we haven't had to pause and stop and kind of fight to bring in a JV partner and hold up activity for that. Having been able to fund this, ourselves via our shareholders has been amazing to do, because it's meant we've been able to chase this and get it done much quicker than we ordinarily would have with a JV partner. Excited for this next well. Obviously, it's and again feeling a lot more comfortable leading into this one for a number of reasons. We've battle hardened from the previous one. We've made the right changes to the team, to the well design, to the program, and so it's now in it's coming around the corner. We're going to be drilling in about a month's time, so it's come around again fairly quickly, and looking forward to an exciting campaign, and then building from there. So the work won't be done post Mukuyu-2. It's really just starting. So and then we've got an exciting period ahead of us, and a lot more to come. And again, thanks to you, Matt, who's been a part in I guess highlighting this as well, and giving a forum and the opportunity for a lot of our shareholders also to be able to ask more detailed questions than I can put out in an ASX release or across in a presentation. Even presenting it, it's a great format, and really enjoy our talks and chats. And Jamie, again, with your background and being in the industry, you understand, I think, some of the issues that we have, and the challenges, and what I guess what the results mean as well. I think that's also been hard to digest for some people, because it is still new, it's still early, it's still in the early days, this basin, and but it's exciting. So just thanks again for hosting another one of these, and all your work in collating the questions, and yeah, I've really enjoyed our chat, and look forward to one hopefully in the near term when we're discussing more results, or on a different trajectory after this one as well.
Absolutely, and likewise, Scott. I think I always appreciate your sincere and available executive, and that's not always the case. And we're 2.5 hour mark here, so I want to thank you for your time and your patience and your willingness to articulate these conversations and these answers. Right? Lots and lots of hunger for information. You're more than willing to step up to the plate here and kind of dismantle these conversations for 2.5 hours. I know that there's lots of people cheering for you and your company and for the country for success. So on that note, I guess, Scott, I thank you very much, and till next time. Have a good day, guys.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jamie, and thanks everyone for